Hello and welcome to this special highlights episode of The Charity Show, the podcast for charity insiders by charity insiders. Please rate, follow or subscribe to us on our usual podcast platform, and here's what's coming up as we take a look back at season 1.
And the British people were continuing to give to charity. And what that has meant for this country is that £13.9 billion was donated by the British public, which is just amazing. But less people are giving.
So I'm not one of these people who believes that there's going to be a complete bonfire of jobs. But I think that you have to be ready for a situation where your organisational structure and roles and responsibilities and delivery models and indeed your culture is probably going to look very different.
That's always a bit nervy. To actually change what you're called is a huge step to take. You're looking at something which has no story around it. There's nobody stood next to it filling in the gaps for you. There's no photos. There's no other visuals to go with it. So I think there's that bit where you need to back it up with research. You need to have some of those conversations. You need to make some sensible decisions. But at some point, you're going to have to take that leap.
Hello and welcome to this rather different episode of The Charity Show as we take a look back at season 1. My name's Tim Beynon, Head of Marketing Engagement at the Firefighters Charity, and although I say we'll take a look back at the last few episodes, basically it's just me this week, as Piers is busy sunning himself on a beach somewhere, probably no doubt browsing the voluntary sector manifesto as he sips a pina colada by the pool. But anyway, we're both basically taking a couple of weeks off over the summer, so we thought what better way to fill the gap than by listening back to some of the best bits from our first 7 episodes. And I must say it's been a brilliant first few months. Piers and I have both really enjoyed it, and we're really hugely grateful for all the incredible feedback you've given us. As well, of course, as being incredibly grateful to all those amazing guests who've joined us on the show. When we set out to do this, we wanted to make a show that gave other charity professionals, not that I'm really sure Piers and I can call ourselves professionals, but anyway, never mind. We wanted to give listeners something that could hopefully inspire them to think differently, to hear from folks who are doing great things and who have a great story to share. People like Alex Staniforth, the inspirational founder of Mind Over Mountains, who we spoke to in episode 1. Tell me a little bit about the inspiration. You touched on the inspiration there for the charity a little bit, but tell me a little bit more about that in terms of what inspired you to launch the charity. And then also, what inspired you to launch it in 2020 when the world was heading towards somewhat of a lockdown on a global scale. So tell me about those two things.
Sure. So first question around inspiration, it came purely from my own experiences. I think most charities start with a problem and trying to be a solution to the problem. And every charity exists to not exist. Sadly, I don't think we're ever going to eradicate a problem as big as mental ill health. I've suffered with my own mental health battle since I've been a teenager. I've been very lucky that I've been pretty high functioning, but I've had anxiety since I was a kid. Several bouts of, low mood and depression. I had an eating disorder, bulimia, for 8 years. And I naturally and fortunately found the outdoors and running or walking or cycling just gave me a way to not to cure that, but to manage it. And I feel that everybody should have access to that. I think with access to more natural tools is not just a plaster on the problem, it's a proactive tool for stopping people getting into a really good place. And so what really struck me was when I did climb the UK, which was one of my big challenges, I mentioned before, climbing to the highest of all the counties in the UK, nearly 5,000 miles of cycling, walking and running and kayaking. It took me longer to get an appointment for my bulimia than it did to cycle, run, walk 5,000 miles. And I was like, wow, I feel really fortunate because I've got something that can help me get, back up again from the trough. What about everybody else? And it really struck me. And the idea for Mind Over Mountains was never really planned. I mean, I never planned to start a charity at 24, but the demand, and the need was there. So as a result of being open and talking about my struggles, writing on social media, writing blogs and articles, all the press around the Climb the UK Challenge gathered quite a lot of interest. And I got approached by a group called Adventure Uncovered who wanted to do an event just to promote the benefits of the outdoors and mental health. And they wanted me to be like an ambassador for that. So naturally, I kind of threw myself at it. And with my friend Chris, we designed this weekend retreat, which combines all the elements I've just mentioned. And I guess I wanted it to give people tools, not just walking, because we know that helps, but you have to keep on doing it. How can you give people tools that they can use every day? And so kind of built it around that concept, and we've stayed with that approach ever since. And I don't think there's anybody else that is quite using that same combination. And that's me, it's the combination is what makes the difference and the impact. But we did that weekend in 2018 in the Lake District, and it was just, we were blown away by it. We thought we had something quite powerful. So we decided to do it again in 2019. And then we thought if we register as a charity, then we're going to be able to get funding and reach more people. We started the registration process in spring of 2020, and obviously not having a clue what was going to happen next. We had our very first trustee meeting literally as this was all kicking off. And little did we know that we wouldn't have a face-to-face trustee meeting for another 18 months. But actually, we had a lot of benefits to starting in that, because we were so small. It was to begin with, it was just me and Chris and our trustees. So there was no paid staff, there was no assets or anything. We didn't have to worry about cash flow. Like a lot of charities really struggled in that time. We were very agile. I hate to use that word, but we were very agile. And there were a lot of people needing our help. And although we couldn't do our walks or retreats, we had to cancel everything we had planned until summer 2020. We just adapted. And so actually we were able to grow very, very quickly because of it. And we were in a position to help people. So that was kind of what we were there to do.
Every cloud has a silver lining, as it were. Incredible.
Always
incredible. It does strike me as incredibly brave of you to not only launch at that time, but also, at 24 and having had that the personal experience and the setting up of the events that you have done. Did you have any idea at that point of the kind of administrative task that was lying ahead of you in terms of setting up a charity, or was that very much a sort of baptism of fire when you got to that point?
Definitely a baptism of fire. The Charity Commission did not make it easy. They wanted to put hoops up for everybody. And luckily, Chris had been a charity trustee, so he had some experience, whereas I had none whatsoever. And that was why we started as a CIC, because it was so much easier. We were able to operate without having all the governance and the trustees and things. It really opened my eyes. And people ask me quite a lot. I've had a message this week about asking for advice and starting a charity, and I'll happily share anything I've learned. And the initial setup wasn't too bad, but I think at that point I had never even imagined that the charity would be where it is now. And the irony being that 2021, about a year later, both Chris and myself had burnt ourselves out, and I was in a really, really bad place, which is kind of ironic for a mental health charity. And I'm sure there's many small charities out there that are, kind of founder-led, having a similar position. And that was when I had to say to our board of trustees, this isn't sustainable. And we made a decision that we needed to, kind of hire somebody full time, employ a CEO or an MD, and so we did that, and now the charity is absolutely flying, and it's allowed me to, step back and support them where I'm most impactful.
What an amazing guy Alex is. Since that show, he's taken on an epic running challenge and is now leading Mind Over Mountains on its most ambitious fundraising campaign ever. So well done, Alex. You're an inspiration, mate. Good stuff. In episode 2, we were joined by Richard Jain, who had just completed a major rebrand for Brainkind. So that made him the perfect candidate to talk to us about all things brand, the common mistakes charities make with rebranding, and the vital things and people they shouldn't forget.
In any project like this, you've got the most important stakeholder groups. The most important stakeholder group you've got is the people you support. Are you going to is it going to be appropriate for them? Is it going to be representative of them and what they need the rest of your stakeholders to do? But actually, in a rebranding project, your very close second and with the power to sink or swim your project is your staff and your colleagues. So they need to go out and feel really, it needs to represent them, and they need to go out and advocate for your new brand, your new positioning, your new messaging. Go out and use it. So it's really important to talk to those two groups first and foremost, and many others that you need to work through, but those two first and foremost. So we did that with putting together workshops and meetings. So we worked with an agency on the rebrand, and they did lots of strategy research. They spoke to our clinical colleagues, our central support services, our corporate colleagues, and the people we support, and asked them about, this is the direction we're going to go in. What is it you'd like to see us become? What does it mean to be? What does the Disabilities Trust mean to you? And what do you want it to mean in the future? So there's some physical meetings there. There's some surveys. So we did some name testing, and we surveyed staff and other stakeholder groups as well. But we also had co-production sessions. We spoke to people we support and took them through the plans in the same way that we'd spoken to the staff. And ultimately, we had a brand steering group, which was the board with authority in the organisation, with some trustees, some senior managers, some people we support, and some clinical staff, to sense check the decisions we were making and the direction of travel we were taking. So we had a number of ways of doing that research and having those conversations and running that co-production throughout the process. At a couple of stages, we then had open sessions of Teams meetings or Zoom calls. We had open invitation to staff, particularly, to talk about the timings that were coming. At the first stage, when we'd chosen a name, we went through the process we'd been through, the things that had been rejected, the reasons why, the decisions we'd taken, and then the next steps. And then that led up to launch last September, where we did another session with people to tell them what was coming. Here's the materials that are on the way, all the nice, exciting, creative bits that were coming, and the launch date, to really try and galvanise that support amongst the staff. And as I say, use them as our advocates.
That's a really interesting point there. I think the consultation amongst staff and of staff is obviously really, really crucial. You want your people to buy into what you're doing. But change is a scary prospect for some people, isn't it? Especially perhaps people who've been around an organisation for a long time. How did you help those people? How did you sort of work with those people to reassure them that this was a change for the good?
Yeah, I have to say, I can't remember. There's only a couple of points I can remember in this particular process where we had those issues. As I say, we'd had a number of years of the organisation wanting to do this. It then just comes down to the how. One of those times is when it was one of the not many organisations work on a full renaming as well. That's always a bit nervy. To actually change what you're called is a huge step to take. And I think there's a bit in the process where you choose the name, and then inevitably you have to spend quite some time working on the creative to support it. And that's a really difficult moment, because you can present the facts and you can present the research, and you can say, this is what this research is telling us, but we've got to make a decision, and there's some practical things to put in there as well. But you're looking at a black and white name. You're looking at something which has no story around it. There's nobody stood next to it filling in the gaps for you. There's no photos. There's no other visuals to go with it. So I think there's that bit where you need to back it up with research. You need to have some of those conversations. You need to make some sensible decisions. But at some point, you're going to have to take that leap.
Sarah White, the chief executive of a brilliant small charity called SuperShoes, which creates bespoke, hand-designed shoes for children with cancer, shared her incredible journey with us in episode 3, shining a light on the challenges of starting and building a charity from an idea that started life on her kitchen table. The model for SuperShoes very much relies on, at its heart, you have that army of artists. Tell us a little bit about how that works, how you work with them, and how that whole sort of model of engagement with your volunteers works.
Well, I think it's we have 250 volunteer artists currently, and the way it works is they get to choose as and when they paint. So we ask an artist when they join our team to paint a minimum of 3 pairs a year. But to be honest, painting SuperShoes is quite addictive, and most people have painted 10 pairs within a space of 2 months, and so it goes on. And we've got artists that have painted over 100 pairs. We've got one artist in particular that's painted over 200 pairs. And I think what it is for our volunteer artists especially is that they may not be fortunate enough to make a living from their creativity. It's few and far between can you actually earn a great living from art, unfortunately. So we have a lot of artists that have this amazing gift and talent, but they don't use it as their day job. And for them to be able to paint such a unique gift for a very, very poorly child, and then actually to see that child wearing them is really magical. I mean, what a great gift. You are so much part of the journey for that recipient and their family.
Does the artist ever correspond directly with the child, or do you act as kind of an intermediary between them? How does that work?
Yeah, exactly. We're an intermediary, and we facilitate any communication. So with an artist's pack, when they receive a blank pair of shoes and a design brief, they also receive a little card. Because we recognise that when artists are painting for a recipient, you build up a connection for who you're painting for, and it's almost like every brushstroke you're thinking about the recipient and injecting hope into those shoes as they're being painted. So all artists can write a little card, and the child receives that. And of course, likewise, if we receive emails and cards, which we do, then we share that back with the artists. But they don't have direct contact.
Of course. Obviously, June is coming into Volunteers Week very, very soon. When this goes out, Volunteers Week may well have passed. But June always shines a spotlight on the incredible work of volunteers across our sector. Tell us a little bit about, as you grow and that number of volunteers grows, how do you engage with them? How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them as part of your army of volunteers? How does that work? Is that an increasingly hard challenge as you grow in size?
Yeah, yes and no. I think the way that we work is we have a closed Facebook group where all of our artists are members of that group. So that's where we communicate about what the charity's doing, what we need right now. So it has such a lovely team aspect to it. Although these are individual artists, we're all working towards this bigger cause, this bigger picture. And that's how everybody feels part of it. And people share their artwork on there, and there's a lot of beautiful interactions where maybe an artist has found a great technique for creating a galaxy sky and they filmed how to do it, and that will be, it's a very giving environment. The whole Facebook group in itself, having all these volunteers in one place. And I think when an artist signs up and becomes part of that, they feel that even though they're not in the same location, we have artists all over the country. It's a big part of what we do, that they feel part of it. And of course, that's where they select the shoes that they paint as well within that group.
In episode 4, Piers and I pretended to know what we were talking about when we were joined by charity, digital and AI guru Zoe Amar. Zoe chatted us through the incredible potential that AI has for reshaping the way charities work, and where they need to be investing their time and money to get the most out of this exciting new technology.
Where do you think charities should be focusing their energy going forward?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, because for me, it's going to be about what you have learned from what you've done so far. And every charity is at a different stage with that. I mean, I've spoken to 2 quite well-known charities already today who are at quite different stages with AI. So where I have commonly seen charities start to adopt AI over the last year, it's for some of those use cases that we talked about in terms of the creating the content, meeting notes, but also maybe starting to think about how might we use these tools in order to analyse our data and better understand our beneficiaries and target campaigns. But it really depends on what you have managed to do so far and what you feel confident about doing, what your staff are skilled up to do, what you've got the capacity and headspace to do, and also what on earth is going on with your wider digital transformation. So there are charities I speak to where they've got a lot of interest in how they can use AI tools to understand their data and get better insight from it, make better decisions from it, such as how they better target campaigns. But if your data's in a mess, if the data quality isn't there, if the data's sitting on 6 different databases, if your data flows are sort of all over the place, that's going to be a real challenge, and that's going to limit your AI maturity and the return on investment you get from using these tools. So where I think this stuff is a real opportunity is where it will prompt you to review and rethink your digital transformation journey so far. And if any of those foundations, those building blocks are in place, not or yet, and if you don't have them yet, to plan for how you make sure you get them to be put in place.
That's really, really interesting, because obviously as a health charity, we see a lot of AI being used, very obviously in the research where it's crunching health data and patients' data and, cancer treatments and all of that sort of stuff. But then more on a day-to-day charity level, because obviously AI, the worry for people is it going to affect the creative side of things? Is it going to affect the comm side of charities? And does that inevitably lead to cost cutting? Does that inevitably lead to losing jobs? Do you think that's the case, or is this yet to be sort of seen in the real world?
Well, I think this is all about how we end up approaching this in organisations, and I do hope we'll see more cross-sector collaboration on it. So if you talk to someone like Rodri Davis, who I think is a very, very insightful on this, I know that one of the things that he's concerned about, and I obviously share these concerns as well, is that if charities are very reactive on this, and if they stick their heads in the sand and they think, well, just, let it sort of develop very organically, and then you may get to a point where you almost fall off a cliff if your fixed costs are very high, and you're thinking, well, actually, there's a sort of AI solution I could use, and that means that I only need 2 people in my fundraising team as opposed to 5. And you want to avoid being in that situation, right? Because the organisational knowledge, the donor knowledge that people in those jobs will have, there's a way for those people to be retrained. Perhaps their roles look slightly different, for them to be skilled up in these tools so they can continue to make a huge amount of difference. So I'm not one of these people who believes that there's going to be a complete bonfire of jobs. But I think that you have to be ready for a situation where your organisational structure and roles and responsibilities and delivery models, and indeed your culture, is probably going to look very different.
It was a case of back on more familiar ground in episode 5, as we were joined by Katie Docherty, Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, to explore today's fundraising landscape and the challenges facing charities, from the impact of technology to the cost of living crisis. Katie told us what it's really like for fundraisers today. What's it like at the moment for the third sector? What kind of landscape are we working in?
Well, I mean, the good news to start with is that this remains a country filled with a lot of generous people. And the British people are continuing to give to charity. Nearly 3 out of 4 British adults did something charitable last year, whether that was donating money, volunteering, or sponsoring somebody. And what that has meant for this country is that £13.9 billion was donated by the British public, which is just amazing. And that's up from 10 billion before the pandemic. But less people are giving. So there's a challenge in there. So less people are giving, but those who are giving more. And so whilst there's more money, the future is challenging, and there is no doubt out there that the world is a difficult place for charities who are trying to meet ever-increasing needs all the time.
I saw that figure of £13.9 billion. It blew me away. It's an incredible sum, and it puts us right at the top of the table in terms of being one of those most philanthropic of countries in the world, which is fantastic. But it kind of goes against a bit in all that we've heard about the cost of living crisis having an impact on fundraising and being negatively impacting charities. Has that been overplayed, do you think? or actually, would that figure have been greater had it not been for the cost of living crisis?
Well, yeah. So the figure would have been greater if the number of people who used to donate were still donating. So to give you an idea what that looks like in terms of numbers, before the pandemic, 65% of people made some form of donation to a charity, and that's dropped to 58%, which is a lot of people when you think about how many adults there are in this country. So it's offset by the fact that those people are giving more, but there are less of them. And so that is a concern for charities looking ahead to the future, because there's so many charities under so much pressure because inflation means that the amount of money they're getting in doesn't go as far. The pressure on services is so much higher, and therefore the need for the British public to carry on being generous is so important. But if that decline in the number of people donating continues, that's definitely a concern.
Do you think as well, are people giving differently? I saw in that report about the number of committed donors. I think that figure of 65% down to 58% was from the way I read it, is that was sort of committed donors, people giving regularly on a monthly basis that's dipped. Do you think because of the cost of living crisis that maybe people are changing the way they give and perhaps not committing so much, but giving more on a one-off basis, perhaps? Are you seeing that as a pattern?
So there's a lot of different reasons in there as to why this is happening. So yes, people are donating in a different way. So technology is having a huge impact on that. As we use cashless, people are giving via QR codes and credit cards and online in a way that they never did before, and that number continues to grow every year by huge amounts. But also, and I think this is where, when we're looking at why are the numbers of people donating dropping, most people give in response to a direct ask. So all the research says that that's why people give. Somebody asks them and connects with them on a cause. But there are less ways for charities to make those asks now. So restrictions in data protection and things like that mean that it's more difficult to make that ask of donors. And in return, that means that less people are donating.
Far from sending us to sleep in episode 6, Vicki Beevers, Chief Executive of the Sleep Charity, told us all about the importance of good strategy. Voted the Charity Comms Strategic Leader of the Year, Vicki also discussed some of the common mistakes and issues that charities can face if they either get their strategy wrong or they try to go it alone with no strategy at all.
What do you think are the dangers of not having a clear strategy to a charity?
Yeah, I think there are so many dangers, because you can drift away from your mission quite easily. So it can be tempting, especially when there's little funding coming out, that you can jump on funding and try to make your sort of projects, your service delivery fit funding, which actually isn't about your priority. So I think it's really important that you've got a strategy, you've got a clear idea of what you're aiming at and what you're focusing on, so that you can really focus on that and not let yourselves drift. Having said that, I think there's got to be some flexibility. So although we've got sort of a 3-year strategic plan, it may be that actually sometimes we start to do things that we're down in year 3, because it may be that things have changed within the news or there's been new research. So it's not sort of sticking to it so rigidly that you miss really important opportunities that come along as well. So it's having that flexible approach is important too.
Yeah, there's so much to consider, isn't there? But obviously, strategy is something that it's a buzzword that fills the sector, and every charity says, "Oh, we're working to our strategy. We got a 3-year plan. We got a 5-year plan." But where do you think some charities fall down when it comes to strategy? Were there any sort of fundamental things? You mentioned strategic drift and people not sticking to their plans. Is that at the heart of where charities fall down, or are there other things that perhaps charities are just making fundamental mistakes when it comes to strategy?
Well, I think like with the smaller charities, that often the strategy doesn't exist. And I know that I do a lot of pro bono work supporting like small grassroots organisations, and they want to do a lot of good and they want to do it quickly, and they perhaps don't have the skills or the resources to put that strategy in place. So I think, a lot of it is about being under-resourced, but actually it's got to be a priority because it's important that everyone's working to do the same thing. And I think it's probably around communication as well. So it's important that everybody knows what's being worked towards, that everyone has an input into it so that there's some ownership of the strategy. The team, whether that's teams of volunteers, trustees, whether it's, employees, have had an input into the strategy. So it belongs to us all. And we've got a team meeting next week, and I've just been printing out our strategic aims again. And what we do is we review them. So we break them down into the business plan so that you can see the flow of the work, so it's meaningful. And I rag rate everything throughout the sort of financial year, so we can see how we're progressing towards different elements of the strategy. So it's really quick and easy. You can see it's red. We need to work on that. I'll consider if it should stay in the strategy this year. It's green, it's done, ambers and stuff that's ongoing. So I think systems in place is really important as well. And they don't have to be complex, simple, because we've got enough complex work to do in the charity sector right now.
And last time out in episode 7, we got the inside line on what the new Labour government might have in store for the third sector when we spoke to Saskia Koynenburg from NCVO as she begins the challenge of holding Keir Starmer to account in regard to the voluntary sector manifesto and ensures that we all get a seat at the table when it comes to policy making in the future.
We saw the chance for an election this year as a real opportunity to engage a potential new government, although now we see we have got a new government, with the challenges and really lay out our stall as a voluntary sector. So we worked with NCVO and engaged with lots of different members around the country. We did workshops, we did online sessions, from the real big charities to our small grassroots organisations to really understand what they would want to see in a voluntary sector manifesto. And we had everything. We heard everything. So we had a huge wealth of information from, really micro issues that are important to certain members to, huge world-changing ideas that we would all love to see but might not be able to really get traction on at the moment. So we then did a big task with NCVO, really working through all those different things and really pulling together what would be effective for us as a whole sector. So we really tried to kind of take the top level asks and put them into something that would really work for everyone, because our roles are to try and improve the charity sector, the voluntary sector, and make it really impactful. So what would that be? And so we decided that the best way to do that as well is to offer solutions. So not just go with a whole list of asks of what we want, to also use the manifesto to demonstrate what we could do as a sector. We very much feel, I'm sure lots of listeners feel as well, that we are overlooked as a sector, often undervalued, that our talents, our skills, our expertise really aren't often taken into that initial decision-making process. So the Voluntary Sector Manifesto is very much for the sector, with the sector, and to really shine a light on the sector to say, this is what we can do, this is how we can help you achieve great things if you work with us.
Fantastic. I can imagine it's a monster piece of work. One thing we've certainly seen with the show, if you ask people for their opinion in this sector, they will give it. So I'm sure you ended up with a wealth of stuff, and actually paring that down into a manifesto, I'm sure was a real challenge. But looking at some of the key headlines, looking at the manifesto, there's basically 7 key headlines, aren't there? Perhaps you could just talk us briefly through them, because just to rattle them off, we've got engage charities in policy making, ensure fair and sustainable partnerships, make sure every voice is heard, build strong and resilient communities, place value on volunteers, support a thriving charity sector, and make public giving easier. That's a huge amount of work. There's a lot in there, isn't there?
Yeah, and under each heading, we then have other specific asks. So it is quite a meaty document. So engaging charities in policy making is where we feel that the best policy solutions that will make a real good impact on our communities
are those that are created or co-created with the voluntary sector and actually involve the voices of people who are going to be impacted by those policy decisions. So we started talking about whether we could get commitment to establishing a civil society charter, and that's something that we're working on now as with other infrastructure bodies and with our members, whether we could develop a civil society engagement strategy, so how we can really get the voices of those who will be impacted by decisions to the right areas. And it's not just DCMS. So quite often we work with just DCMS, and that's where our strongest engagement has been. But, decisions made by the Treasury are, hugely important to communities and the charities supporting them, and how we can also, within that policy making, look at working cooperatively with other administrations and devolved powers. So the second part is ensuring fair and sustainable partnerships. So this is all about making it much easier for voluntary sector organisations to play a part in public service delivery. We know there have been lots of challenges around that. So how can we make public service contracts be delivered by charities in a fair and equitable way? Another really important part of the manifesto is making sure every voice is heard. So how do we really raise the voices of communities so that, they are heard by those decision makers? And that goes in terms of campaigning and people's rights and freedom to protest, to also how we might suggest reforming electoral law. We talk about building strong and resilient communities. So in there's some stuff around the Shared Prosperity Fund, but there's also a lot around like the Community Power Act and developing strategies to support really direct investment into social infrastructure. Volunteers, of course, we couldn't have a voluntary sector manifesto without placing value on volunteers. So we're looking in this for support on our vision for volunteering, but also looking at Volunteers Week, Big Help Out, and how we really create the environment for people to volunteer. So breaking down any barriers to volunteering. We want to support a thriving charity sector. So this could be about improving tax systems, the voluntary workforce, protecting the independence of the Charity Commission. And then finally, we talk about making public giving easier. So a lot around gift aid, philanthropy, and innovation in giving fund, and things like that. So really to help charities, who do rely on fundraising, so that that's a real sustainable stream for them.
So that's it. Now you're up to date. 8 episodes might seem like a bit of an odd number to end a season on, and you're probably right. But there you go, Piers and I need a holiday. So we'll be back in September. In fact, on the 16th of September to be precise. And in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. If you've got a story to share, if you've done something innovative, new or amazing, or if your charity is doing something the rest of us need to know about, come on to the show in season 2 and tell us all about it. You'll find all the links you need in the show notes. So until the 16th of September, look after yourselves and enjoy the rest of the summer. Take care.